Life stories. Arrested for nothing. How one black woman lawyer took on police brutality and won. It was a bright, warm afternoon in Austin, Texas. The park was alive with the sounds of children laughing, dogs barking, and joggers pushing through their routines along the winding trails. Zilker Park, with its wide-open spaces and towering oak trees, was a place where the city's vibrant energy met the quiet calm of nature. Families gathered around picnic tables, while others enjoyed the tranquil beauty of Lady Bird Lake. For many, it was an oasis, a place to unwind and escape from the frenetic pace of everyday life. Among the visitors to the park that afternoon was Elena Morales, a sharp, focused attorney known for her commitment to justice and equality. At 32, Elena had built a reputation as one of the top civil rights lawyers in Austin. Despite the demanding nature of her career, she often found solace in moments like this, small pockets of peace carved out from her busy schedule. On this particular day, Elena was sitting on a bench near the pond, a thick hardcover book resting on her lap. The sound of the pages turning was the only noise she made, the crisp fall air providing a perfect backdrop for her brief respite. Her dark, curly hair framed her face, and her sharp eyes scanned the words in front of her with the precision of a lawyer dissecting a case. But as much as she tried to immerse herself in the story, she couldn't ignore the weight of the world outside the pages. She knew the work she did, fighting for justice and holding institutions accountable, was exhausting. Suddenly, the serenity of the afternoon was shattered by the screech of tires. Elena looked up, startled, as a police cruiser pulled up to the curb just a few feet from where she sat. The car came to a stop, and the doors swung open. Two officers stepped out, their expressions stern and rigid. They stood tall, radiating authority, as their eyes immediately fixed on her. "Ma'am, may we speak with you for a moment?" one of the officers called out, his voice laced with suspicion rather than politeness. Elena closed her book slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly as she looked up at the officers. Her demeanor remained calm, impossible to read. She was used to being questioned, even challenged. As an attorney, she had faced much worse in the courtroom. But this felt different. This felt targeted. "Of course," she replied, her voice steady, betraying none of the unease she felt inside. She set the book aside carefully on the bench. The second officer, Officer Collins, moved closer, his tone still clipped and formal. "We got a call about some suspicious activity in this area. Mind telling us what you're doing here?" Elena raised an eyebrow, momentarily puzzled. Suspicious activity? She was just sitting in the park, reading. But she didn't voice her confusion. Instead, she kept her voice even, choosing her words carefully. "I'm reading," she said simply, holding up the book to prove her point. "Is that a problem?" Officer Harris exchanged a glance with Collins before demanding, "Can we see some ID?" Elena's pulse quickened, but she kept her composure. There was no reason for this, no reason at all. She reached into her bag slowly, pulling out her driver's license and handing it over. "Elena Morales," Harris read aloud, his tone almost mocking. "What's your business here, Miss Morales?" Elena inhaled deeply, maintaining her calm. She glanced around. A small crowd had begun to gather, their whispers growing louder. Some were clearly curious, while others exchanged uncomfortable glances. Elena's stomach churned as she realized what was happening. She had handled many tense situations in courtrooms, but this was different. This wasn't about legal arguments or case law. This was about her right to exist in public space without being questioned. "I live here," she replied, her voice firm. "I came here to enjoy the park. Is that really so suspicious?" Harris's lips tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he handed her ID back, but neither officer made any move to leave. Instead, they lingered, continuing to ask questions that felt less like routine and more like an interrogation. "Do you always carry a book like that around?" Collins sneered, glancing at the hardcover in her hands. "Are you alone?" Harris added, his hand resting on his belt in a deliberately intimidating manner. Elena's stomach tightened. She had been in countless confrontations in court, but this was different. The power dynamic was stark. She could feel the tension in the air, the growing unease from the onlookers. The subtle shift in the way they spoke to her, it was all too familiar. "I'm not answering any more questions unless you tell me what I'm being accused of," she said, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. That seemed to trigger something in them. "Don't get smart with us," Harris snapped, stepping forward, his posture menacing. "We're just doing our job." "I know the law," Elena replied, her voice unwavering, "and I'm not breaking it by sitting in a public park." But reason was not part of their agenda. Without warning, Officer Harris reached for her arm. "You're resisting," he said, though Elena hadn't moved an inch. "What are you doing?" she exclaimed, startled, but the words barely left her mouth before she felt the cold metal of handcuffs snap around her wrists. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, but the officers remained unbothered, ignoring the growing voices that questioned their actions. One bystander, a young woman, pulled out her phone to record the scene, and for a brief moment, Elena locked eyes with her. It was a silent plea, a request to capture the injustice unfolding before them. But as the car door slammed shut, Elena knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. Inside the cramped back seat of the police cruiser, Elena sat still, her body rigid with the shock of the arrest. Her wrists throbbed from the handcuffs, but her mind was racing. The absurdity of it all weighed heavily on her. How had a peaceful afternoon, spent reading in a public park, turned into this? How had her right to enjoy the space she called home been stripped from her in an instant? The sound of the police radio crackled in the background, the only noise breaking the suffocating silence between Elena and the officers. Officer Collins kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, his expression a mix of boredom and indifference. Harris was driving, glancing at Elena every now and then, as if waiting for her to say something, anything, to make him feel justified in his actions. But Elena remained silent, her gaze focused out the window, her reflection merging with the passing scenery. The trees of Austin blurred as they drove, and she couldn't help but think about how quickly everything could have escalated further. As they pulled up to the police station, Elena steeled herself for what was to come. She had spent years defending clients in similar situations, standing up for justice in courtrooms, but now she found herself on the other side of the system she had fought so hard to uphold. The irony of it all wasn't lost on her, and the weight of it all made her stomach churn. Inside the station, the booking process was exactly what she'd expected: dehumanizing, invasive, and designed to break her down. She was fingerprinted, photographed, and led to a small holding cell with buzzing fluorescent lights that seemed to amplify the tension in the air. The hum of the lights made her feel like she was in a sterile cage, as if the whole process was meant to strip her of her dignity. One of the officers, a younger man who had been silent during the ride, approached her cell holding a clipboard. He looked at her, a slight shift in his demeanor as if he recognized who she was. Elena didn't care. She wasn't interested in his sympathy. "Miss Morales," he said flatly, "you've been charged with resisting arrest and obstructing a peace officer." Her eyes flickered with a sharp, calculating look. "On what grounds?" she demanded, her voice cold but controlled. The officer hesitated for a moment before responding. "You can discuss that in court." Elena let out a slow breath, trying to steady her pulse. She had faced far worse in courtrooms, but the bitter taste of injustice gnawed at her. This wasn't just about her, it was about everyone who had been unjustly treated by a system that claims to protect them. She would fight, and she would win. She had to. Hours passed before anyone spoke to her again. The silence inside the cell was deafening, the oppressive atmosphere a stark contrast to the park she had so recently enjoyed. She closed her eyes for a moment, replaying the events of the afternoon in her mind. She thought about the officers' harsh words, the condescending tone of their questions, and the ease with which they had dismissed her humanity. She had known this kind of prejudice existed, but experiencing it firsthand was a different kind of blow. Finally, the door to the cell opened again, and Elena's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. She looked up to see Kara, her colleague and close friend, standing in the doorway. Kara's expression was a mix of relief and concern, and without a word, she stepped inside, walking toward Elena. "Are you okay?" Kara asked softly, her voice filled with worry. Elena gave her a tight smile, though her body betrayed her with a slight tremor. "I'm fine," she said, the words hollow as they left her mouth. She wasn't fine, but she wasn't going to show weakness either. Not here, not now. Kara sat beside her, taking a deep breath as she looked at Elena. "We'll get you out of here. This is insane, Elena." Elena nodded, though her mind was already focused on what came next. "I'm not letting this slide, Kara," she said firmly. "Not this time." Kara's grip on the bench tightened, and she met Elena's gaze. "What are you thinking?" Elena's eyes hardened with resolve. "I'm thinking it's time to use everything I know to fight back. I have the tools, the knowledge, and the resources to make sure this doesn't go unchallenged." The following days were a blur of legal work, phone calls, and strategy sessions. Elena refused to let the humiliation of the arrest define her. She threw herself into the work, outlining a civil rights lawsuit against the officers and the police department. She knew the fight ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was ready. And with every email of support she received, with every phone call, she grew more determined. The video of her arrest had gone viral, and the community began to rally around her. People from all walks of life, those who had experienced similar injustices, those who had seen the video, reached out with messages of support. The movement was growing, and Elena's resolve only grew stronger. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person who had ever been silenced or dismissed by a system that was supposed to protect them. Kara stood by her side through it all. Late nights spent preparing the case, meetings with community leaders, town halls, and rallies. It was exhausting, but it was necessary. Elena didn't just win the case. She wanted to expose the flaws in the system that allowed incidents like hers to happen in the first place. She wasn't going to stop until change was made. In the midst of all the chaos, Elena still found time to attend community meetings, listen to people's stories, and speak out about the importance of accountability in law enforcement. She gave speeches at local colleges, advocating for change and for a system that truly served the people. Her voice was becoming stronger, and the more she spoke, the more people were listening. But even as the case gained momentum, Elena was never far from the pressure that weighed on her. The calls for justice, the support from the community, the demands for change, it was all overwhelming. Elena knew that the fight she was in wasn't just for herself. It was for a future where people no longer had to fear the very people who were supposed to protect them. Weeks passed, and the momentum of the case built. But Elena didn't expect the unexpected twist that would come. One day, as she sat in her office reviewing the case files, her attorney called with surprising news. "Elena," he said cautiously, "there's been a development. You've been assigned as the judge for one of their cases next month." Elena froze, her mind struggling to process the words. The irony was staggering. She had spent weeks preparing to fight these officers in court, but now fate had handed her an entirely different kind of justice. For a moment, she wondered if she could do it. Could she sit on the bench and remain impartial, knowing the officers she was about to judge were the same men who had humiliated her in the park? But then she thought about everything they had put her through, everything that had happened since that fateful day. No, this was not just a coincidence. This was an opportunity to show what real justice looked like. The day of the hearing arrived. Elena stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her black robe. Her reflection seemed distant, as though the woman staring back at her wasn't quite the same person who had walked into Zilker Park weeks earlier. She had spent hours preparing for this moment, not just for the case at hand, but for what it symbolized: the intersection of personal injury, professional responsibility, and the wider call for systemic change. Today, the officers who had arrested her would stand trial, and Elena, the one who had been humiliated, who had been treated with suspicion and contempt, would be the one to decide their fate. The courtroom was buzzing with energy when Elena walked in. A crowd had gathered, both supporters of Elena and those curious about the irony of the situation. News outlets were in attendance, and the room was filled with reporters, attorneys, and spectators eager to see how this story would unfold. Elena took her seat behind the judge's bench, her posture calm and commanding. She glanced briefly at the officers, Officer Harris and Officer Collins, who were seated at the defendant's table. Their eyes widened as they recognized her, and their once confident demeanor faltered. They had no idea that the woman they had wronged would be the one to decide whether their careers would continue. "All rise," the court clerk called, and everyone stood as Elena entered the room. She took her place at the bench, the gavel in her hand. The sound of it striking the desk echoed through the room, signaling the start of the trial. "This court is now in session," Elena said, her voice steady but firm. She addressed the room, her eyes briefly flicking to the officers at the defendant's table. "Please be seated." The room settled into an uneasy silence as the proceedings began. The defense attorney stood first, adjusting his glasses and clearing his throat. He was well-dressed, confident, and accustomed to defending police officers. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice smooth and practiced, "we're here today because of an unfortunate misunderstanding. Officers Harris and Collins were merely doing their job when they encountered Miss Morales. It is not uncommon for police officers to be cautious in unfamiliar situations. They had no intention of overstepping their authority, but rather acted within the bounds of their duty. We will show that their actions were justified and that no excessive force was used. We ask that you find in favor of the officers." Elena didn't flinch. She had heard these kinds of statements many times before in her career. She had even made some of them herself in defense of clients. But this time, the words felt hollow. It wasn't just about legal arguments. It was about what had happened in that park. The questions, the insinuations, the forceful arrest of a woman who had done nothing wrong. Elena had lived this story. It was hers. The prosecutor rose next, his expression somber but determined. "Your Honor, the prosecution will show that the officers involved acted with excessive force. Miss Morales was doing nothing more than enjoying a peaceful day in the park when she was unjustly approached, interrogated, and arrested. The actions taken by Officers Harris and Collins were not routine. They were discriminatory. We will present evidence that these officers abused their power and violated Miss Morales' civil rights. This case is about accountability." Elena nodded, signaling for the defense to call their first witness. But her mind wasn't entirely on the proceedings. It was impossible to ignore the irony of the situation. For months, she had been preparing a case against these very officers. And now, here she was, sitting at the bench, hearing arguments that could determine the course of their lives. The first officer, Officer Harris, was called to the stand. He walked up slowly, his face tight with unease. He swore the oath to tell the truth, his hand on the Bible, before taking his seat. The prosecutor began with his questions. "Officer Harris, can you explain to the court why you approached Miss Morales that day in Zilker Park?" Harris shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable under the prosecutor's gaze. "We received a call about suspicious activity in the park," he said, his voice wavering slightly. "When we arrived, Miss Morales was the only person sitting alone. We were trained to be cautious in situations like this." "Did you have any specific reason to believe Miss Morales was engaging in suspicious activity?" the prosecutor pressed. "No," Harris admitted, his voice growing smaller. "But she was alone in a public space. It seemed odd to us, and we needed to investigate." Elena's eyes narrowed, and she made a note on her pad. There was no evidence of any crime, no indication that she had done anything other than sit peacefully. Yet, Harris's testimony was suggesting that her mere presence had been grounds for suspicion. The prosecutor continued, "And when you approached her, what happened?" "We asked for her ID," Harris replied. "She seemed resistant." "Resistant?" the prosecutor asked, raising an eyebrow. "Was she physically resisting?" No, Harris admitted, but she didn't answer our questions, and that's when we decided to take her into custody. Elena felt her pulse quicken, but she remained still, her expression betraying none of the anger that boiled inside her. This was a pattern she had seen before, the justification of unwarranted actions with flimsy reasoning. As Harris finished his testimony, Officer Collins took the stand. His testimony was almost identical, filled with vague justifications and a refusal to take accountability for the unnecessary escalation of the situation. The courtroom grew tense as witnesses began to testify. Several people who had been in the park that day were called to the stand. Many of them had seen the arrest firsthand and were quick to testify that Elena had not been confrontational or belligerent. A young woman named Jenna had been one of the bystanders who recorded the video that had gone viral. She stepped up to the stand, holding the phone that had captured the arrest. "Can you tell the court what you saw that day?" the prosecutor asked. "I saw two officers approach Miss Morales for no reason," Jenna said, her voice shaking with emotion. "She wasn't doing anything wrong. They just started asking her questions. She tried to stay calm, but they wouldn't listen. They just kept pushing her until they arrested her." The defense attorney tried to discredit Jenna's testimony, but it was clear from her demeanor that she had witnessed something deeply troubling. Elena watched as the pieces of the case began to fall into place. The evidence against the officers was mounting, and the cracks in their story were becoming more visible with every witness who took the stand. After several days of testimony, it was time for closing arguments. The defense attorney's words were laced with desperation as he tried to convince the court that the officers had acted within their rights. But Elena was unmoved. The prosecutor, however, delivered a compelling closing argument, emphasizing the need for accountability and fairness in law enforcement. He spoke passionately about how the actions of Officers Harris and Collins had not only violated Elena's rights, but also contributed to the deep-rooted issues of racial discrimination within the police force. Elena listened intently, her hand gripping the gavel as she prepared to make her ruling. The room fell silent as she stood up. Her voice was calm but unwavering as she addressed the court. This case is not just about two officers. It's about the responsibility of those in power to uphold the rights of every citizen. The officers' actions that day were unjustified. They overstepped their authority, and their behavior is a reflection of a larger problem within the system. It is time for accountability. The room held its breath as Elena delivered her verdict. Officers Harris and Collins will be suspended without pay, required to undergo retraining, and face formal disciplinary action. This ruling is not just a consequence, it is a call for change. We must all do better. She slammed the gavel down with finality. The officers' faces were pale, their shoulders slumped in defeat. They knew the gravity of the situation. As the courtroom cleared, Elena remained at the bench for a few moments, reflecting on everything that had led to this moment. The fight was far from over. The system wasn't perfect, and the road to true justice would be long and difficult. But today was a step forward. Later that evening, Elena attended a community rally. People from all walks of life had come together, united by a shared desire for change. As Elena spoke to the crowd, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This fight wasn't just for her. It was for everyone who had been wronged, everyone who had suffered at the hands of injustice. She had been given an opportunity to make a difference, and she would keep fighting, not just for herself, but for a future where accountability, fairness, and equality were the cornerstones of the system. The story of Elena Morales highlights the power of standing up against injustice, even when it feels like the system is stacked against you. It teaches us that confronting discrimination and holding those in power accountable is not only a personal battle, but a fight for the greater good. Elena's courage in the face of unlawful treatment and her decision to pursue justice demonstrates the importance of using knowledge, strength, and patience to challenge unfair practices. The story also emphasizes the role of community support, how collective voices, whether through viral videos or shared experiences, can spark change. Another important lesson is the importance of self-respect and dignity, even when faced with dehumanizing situations. Elena's refusal to be cowed by her arrest and her determination to seek justice serves as a reminder that personal integrity and persistence can lead to significant societal change. Ultimately, this narrative underscores that justice is not always immediate, but through accountability, awareness, and action, we can work toward creating a more fair and equitable world. It reminds us that standing up for what is right, though difficult, is essential for progress and healing. If you found this video helpful or thought-provoking, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. It really helps more people discover our content. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss the latest updates from our channel. Thanks for watching. We will see you in the next videos.